Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Nature's Decoders, What Leaves Reveal About the Natural World, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Nikki Sentinella. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being with us today. Nikki, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. It is bright and early over here in Australia on Awabakal country, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about some leaves. So I think it's something that we see everywhere. We sort of think about in various ways, but we may not have a full understanding or fragments of understanding about what are leaves? What do they do? And what can they tell us? Because trees can talk, and if we listen, we might be able to pick up some clues. So that's what I want to dive into today. As Rob mentioned, if you want to submit any questions at the end, please do. They're always really interesting, and I love hearing from you guys as well. So don't forget to submit anything that pops into your mind. Firstly, hello, my name's Nikki. I am an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures. I guide here in Australia and also had the absolute fortune to guide up in Churchill. We'll see a couple of glimpses of Churchill for the polar bear season. I am also a biologist when I am not guiding. I am about to head into the field this weekend for 2 weeks out into the desert, and so it's something that very much is my life. I'm probably one to stare at leaves quite often. And I do a bit of photography, so more and more I'm taking photos of those leaves as well. Unfortunately, there will be a few cute animals in the way of some of the leaves, but that's all right. You can look past them and just look at the leaves. So what am I talking about today? This is a little series that I want to put together with my future webinars in July and looking at understanding some of the signals around the world, some of the things that it doesn't matter where we travel, there are indications from nature that we can observe and we can understand. And then hopefully that fosters understanding of what's happening, but also a care for that environment. And so I want to take us in a bit more of a broad look at today leaves. So I'm going to be looking at what are leaves, what's the function of them. I'm going to break down leaves as a way of figuring out what they're doing in 4 basic needs, and I'll go through these needs as a way to think about, okay, if a leaf is looking for light, how is it going to act? And that's going to help us read it, even if we're not thinking about all of the complex mechanisms behind that. I'm going to talk about form, so leaf shape, size, why do we have serrated edges, things like that. And I'm going to look at color because I think that's something pretty classic when we think about leaves is when they change. That's when we take notice of them. So looking at the color of leaves, but also when do they change color when it's not fall. And then I'm going to give some examples. So I have some photos from all over the world, and I'm hoping with me by the end of the webinar, you'll be able to look at some of these photos and see what's happening within that environment. We'll have a photo, you don't know necessarily where it's from, what time of day, maybe cloudy. What can we tell from these leaves? And we can tell things about growth form, we can tell things about which direction north is, which is pretty cool. We can tell things like what the environment would be like, whether it's really windy there, and if there's any impacts from wildlife as well. So hopefully you can follow along with me, and I will talk you through my process, of course, as we go. And then once again, we have questions at the end. So I want you to picture the tree outside your window and picture how many leaves are on that tree, how many individual leaves are on that tree. And then I want you to extend that to every single blade of grass on the lawn and every leaf in a bush. And that number's already getting very, very high. Then we extend that to your neighborhood and then to the city and then countries all over the world. we think of all of the forests, but we also think of all of the prairies and grass plains. We can think about the marine vegetation and all of the leaves within our seagrasses. So it's really hard to fit that concept in your mind. And I think it's hard for us humans to think of trees, to think of leaves and plants for a number of reasons. One of them is the sheer scale, and that trying to think of how many individual leaves there may be in the world seems quite impossible. We have a count for the number of humans. We have a count for a lot of the mammal species, as well as other species around the world. But we don't really think about necessarily that huge green thing that makes our blue and green planet so green. The other thing that makes it hard for us to consider leaves and trees can be the time scale. So if we think about the scale life of a tree that lives for a few hundred years, that's many times our lifespan. And so it's really hard for us to have the same view looking at that longevity, looking for us over many generations, but it's just one single generation for a long-lived species. And that can be really hard for our brains to comprehend. And so it's something that we need to consider when we think about trees, when we think about our nerve impulses, for example. They feel really fast in the roots and the stems of trees. If we look at their electrical impulses, we're looking at a third of an inch per second of those electrical impulses moving through. So things are slow sometimes. Sometimes they're very fast, but we need to consider that time scale as well. So coming back to how many leaves there are, if we think about how much mass there is of the biological material on Earth, we can look at biomass. Of course, people have had a look at this. And so biomass can be taken from a few different measures. If we think of taking all of the mass of each thing, there's a lot of water in that. And so we often talk about the total biomass. We also talk about the dry biomass. So dry, trying to remove all of that water and you're just left with everything else. And then because we're talking about biological material, we also talk about just the carbon mass. So we're looking at the total mass of carbon irrespective of the rest of the thing. Now, when we do this, and it's true of whichever measure you look at, but this diagram shows us in tons of carbon, plants far outweigh everything else. So from this data set, we're looking at 82.4% plants. And especially if you're looking on a phone, it might be a bit small, but the big green one, that's plants. The next one's bacteria, is that purple band on the side. And underneath then we have fungi, archaea, protists. And in that tiny little quadrant in the corner, that's what's then expanded on the right-hand side, and that's where we have our animals. And so when we compare the plants to the animals and when we compare the plants to the humans, which is that tiny little orange blob in the corner, they far outweigh everything. So we're looking at about 450 billion tons of carbon. This is from this data set and a couple of other data sets. And that is quite a lot to comprehend. And again, that's just the carbon in those plant materials. And when we look at that as a global biomass, we're looking around 80% plants. The leaves depends what we're looking at. So obviously, if you look at a big tree, majority of that isn't actually leaf, but it was leaf. The leaf is the main organ that provided for that tree. And so if we look at young plants, we're looking at about 50% of the plant is leaf matter on a very general average. Every species is different, but we're looking for every gram, we have half a gram of leaf. As soon as we get trees over 1,000 kilos, we're looking at the other end, we're looking at 0.05 of a gram. And so that is considerably smaller, and we have 80% is now our trunk. But that energy has come through the leaves and has formed that trunk. So we're still very much paying attention to them. Now, the biomass is so huge. I'm sure you guys are familiar with our basic food pyramid. This is just a very simplistic one, but we need more at the bottom to sustain the top. There needs to be more available so that things can continue to grow and reproduce to then support the things above it. And if we look at a terrestrial system on the right-hand side, we see your simple grasses, grasshoppers, mice, snakes. That's your classic transfer of energy up the food pyramid. If we look at an aquatic system, we actually see that the phytoplankton, which is the thing that produces the food from the sun, compared to the more animal zooplankton, it's actually inverted at the bottom, which is very interesting. And it's also something I'm not going to talk about today. I'm going to focus on the terrestrial system. But this Friday, Melissa Silva, another expedition leader, she's going to be focusing on the marine side. She's going to be talking about all marine flora and how that works. So if you want to look at the marine side of things, tune in on Friday with Melissa. But I'm going to focus a bit more on the terrestrial system. So let's talk about the function. Now, leaves are not just the thing that gets in the way of your photo. In this case, in the way of this koala as the leaves blew in front of my camera. I did get another nice shot, but we're talking about leaves. So they are also able to tell us quite a lot of things. They've been in the background of probably every photo you've ever taken in the wild. They've been in probably most urban photos too. They're also in a lot of our culture. You can see that leaves are all around us and they've been recorded throughout history. The image on the right are some of the columns from the Colosseum, and in the foreground are some beautiful reliefs in some of the tombs and temples in Egypt. And when you go to Egypt as well, there's the talk between the lotus and the papyrus, and they're emblematic of the north and the south of Egypt. And so leaves have been around us for a very, very long time, but they're often overlooked as like a decorative extra thing. So I want to draw our focus into the leaves. And to do that, we'll talk about some of the needs. So plants are primary producers. Primary producers mean that they are the first to produce that food. Most of them are autotrophs, also automatic trough food. They create their own food, and they do that from obviously the sun. So back to our school photosynthesis class. I'm not going to go into all the details. If you want to, I recommend diving deep into the details of photosynthesis and of chlorophyll, because it's really, really interesting. And the more you dig into it, the more interesting it is. But on a general level, we're taking the energy, we're taking that light from the sun, and we're converting it into food. And we convert that into carbohydrates and sugars. Those sugars then chain together and form like our cellulose, which forms the basis of most of our plants. So when we break that down, we're looking at leaves being the most important organ for that plant. Without the leaves, without that photosynthetic material, we're not going to be able to feed ourselves. Food's pretty important. Just ask me at lunchtime. And so we have a few needs that I'm going to talk about. And there are other things, but as a way to break down the, shall we say, priorities of plants or the wants really as well, you can see that these plants are acting based on these needs. So light as a food, we've got water. Water is really important both in and out. We need that water to help move everything around. It's a transport system. And we also need it as part of our photosynthesis. And so it's really important that that water comes in through the roots and then that actually comes out through the leaves. We can talk about shelter, and I'm going to talk about shelter as a way of talking about our abiotic factors, our non-biological factors, as we can think about the structure of strong trunks, but we can also talk about how plants are responding to environmental factors like the wind, like extreme temperatures, things like bushfires, things like frosts and snow, and how they shelter each other against each other as well. What protection do they offer each other? And then we can talk about connection and safety. And here I'm going to talk more about biotic factors. So things like disease and herbivores, insect damage, but also not just things that are trying to eat the plant, but also how the plants are communicating with each other and how they are looking after each other in that system as well. So for light, it is the best solar panel you'll ever get. It's the original one that we've got still existing, and it converts that energy into that sunlight into energy and into food. They do also need other nutrients. They do need nutrients through their roots, and we'll see that as well. But there's a few different ways. Basically, the leaf is the main thing to catch that light. And so a lot of the strategies are going to be looking at how do I get more light, or how do I avoid not getting light from something else. So there's a few different mechanisms. Phototropism is one that's quite often referred to. This is how we make our lucky bamboo, make it spirally. But if you've ever had a pot plant, you can see my peace lily behind me as well is really craning towards the window, which is on this side. So if I didn't tell you, by the end of this, you should have been able to look at my peace lily and tell me which way my window is. And so I turned it around. So phototropism is just trying to get to the light. Photomorphogenesis is just a cool one that I have put in here. This is not to get more light for photosynthesis. This is to get light for plant growth development. And it's at the developmental stages. So we're looking at our little seedlings. So if you ever planted seeds in the ground or in a pot and they start to lean, they are trying to get maximum sunlight for their development. You can see on this little diagram, it's got low blue, low RFR, high blue, low RFR. They're looking at the bands of light, of blue light and red light. That's the R. And the FR is far red. And so the really cool thing about plants is they can feel, and they can feel in the receptors that are converting that sun's energy through those chlorophyll and chloroplasts into that energy, but they only really take red and blue light. They're actually not perfect, and they reflect some of that light back, and that's where we get our green. And so the amount of blue and red they get through tells them how efficient this is. And so a plant can actually feel if next to it is a rock, or if next to it is another plant that it may want to compete with or share with, depending how it's feeling. And so by looking at the amount of specifically blue and red and far red, they can feel the effects of other plants as opposed to things that are not plants, like a building or a roof. And so they can choose what strategy they're going to do. Obviously, if it's a rock, there's not much they can do about moving that rock. So they know that they have to use a different strategy versus maybe it's another plant that they can push through. And so they're feeling this and they're getting this input. So if we think about the light source, we can see how that plant is going to act. And that's how we can control it to make things like our curly, lucky bamboo. People will make shaped trees and plants based on that light. But it also means that if we see a tree that we've never seen before anywhere in the world, you can then tell where the dominant light source is going to be. And you can tell that from a photo, because you don't need the time of day, you don't need the history of that area. Generally may need like northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere if we're going to go for full navigation. But otherwise you can tell quite a lot of things just by how that plant is growing. You may also see a tree that's curving and then changing, and that will tell you that something has changed in the past, because remember, we're looking at the different lengths of time scale compared to us, compared to trees. Maybe there was a tree next to it and now it doesn't have to compete, and now it can use that light. The other needs that we have water. So water are going to come up through the roots and they're going to come out of the stomata. This is a beautiful microscope image of a stomata in the green by the loaf. And it is a pore that opens and closes. It uses water pressure to open and close. And this is where the leaves will release carbon dioxide and release oxygen, take in carbon dioxide, and let out water vapor as well. So this transport and movement system is really important. And this is coming through the leaves. So the leaves have to think about where those stomata are, how many stomata there are. In a square centimeter of a plant leaf, there may be from 1,000 to 100,000 stomata. So there's a lot of these structures, these little pores that will allow that water to pass through. And it's that effort of that water passing out through the leaf that creates that upward pressure from the roots. And so it's the force of that evaporation that is drawing the water up. The water is coming in through the roots, through osmosis, coming up through the xylem and out through the leaf. So water is going to tell us a lot. And plants are also going to use water to direct water towards them or push it away. So we can look at water as one of those needs. If we look at shelter, we're looking at things like the wind. So you can see this tree is in the UK, and this tree has been properly windswept. And so we notice these things without necessarily thinking about why this is happening. And this is what I want to draw your attention to, is what are these leaves doing? What are these trees doing that we can actually read the environment from? And so without knowing anything about this picture, we can assume that the predominant winds are going to be coming from the right of the image. So if I know the predominant wind, I now know which way that tree is facing. Or if I don't know the predominant wind, if I can figure out which way that tree is facing, if I can get a compass, even just on my phone, I can now figure out what the predominant wind in this area is without it being a windy day. So they're telling us a lot of information. And the other things that we can see are adaptations to extreme weather. So we have a fern that's curling over, and that will be when it's really, really hot as well. It's going to be protecting itself. It's going to be trying to shield whenever your, for example, peace lily is wilting, it's telling you that it's too hot or I need water. So those basic needs are being communicated to us. The other one is connection and safety. And so I'm talking about communication with others. I'm sure some of us have heard of the mycorrhizal network, which is the network that connects a lot of trees together through a network of fungi, mushrooms. And the communication of those signals are actually really, really complicated and really interesting. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I really recommend it. I have a couple of books I'll recommend at the end as well for that. And we can see responses to herbivory, and we can learn about what's going on. So, for example, this tree, you can see a classic browsing line. So whatever animals are in there, that's as high as they can reach that eat that tree. So they give us an indication of who's around, even though there's no animals visibly in this picture. I'm sure there's many insects in that picture. So you can see that browsing line is very definitive, and that's giving us a clue. We can also see responses to attacks. So when plants get attacked by insects, they can release chemical signals into the air that nearby plants can pick up. And so they can prepare their chemical defenses at the same time. So that plant is now communicating with the other plant without actually touching them. They can't move without talking through their roots. They can actually do that through the air, through chemical signals. It's really amazing. And so careful which leaves you pick, because they will be talking about you. It's also different responses to being grazed on within the plant, and so they can change their strategy. If you think about mowing your lawn, you are basically simulating grazing. You're grazing the top of your grass, and that grass says, oh, I'm being grazed. I need to put my effort into going out instead of up, because otherwise I'll probably get eaten again. And that's why grass starts so low on the plant, because it's normally getting grazed. The leaves don't start from a top of a stem, because that would get grazed off very easily. So they start right down low, and they often run out to the sides. And that's why we trim our lawns, to keep pushing that effect, to say, hey, grass, you're still being attacked on top. You need to put your effort up. So this is a little diagram, I'm not going to go into everything here, that looks at the mycorrhizal network. but you can see that there's communication between different species, but also different kingdoms. We're looking at fungi communicating with plants. Animals will use these signals as well, and so they can communicate where food is, where water is. They can share those resources, and they can pass that information over a really large distance. It's a really amazing network. For insects, we're looking at like responses to herbivory. You can see a leaf miner in the center here. You can see some galls on the top right. Now, galls are a response to being attacked in some way or nested in some way from various different insects, and the galls produce a route. And if a leaf has one gall versus a leaf has 3 or more galls, the leaf is more likely to drop off with 3 or more by a factor of 4. So it's 4 times more likely to fall if you have 3 or more than 1. And it's 20 times more likely to fall off if there's no galls. So a lot of leaves will drop to defend themselves, defend the rest of the plant. They say, hey, this is not working. I'm going to lose this leaf so that it doesn't spread to my other leaves. And so if you're an insect, you need to be careful of how you trigger these responses. Because if you start to eat too aggressively, or your community starts to eat too aggressively, it's going to kill that tree. It's going to produce a response. You're going to drop to the floor. It's going to be a lot of energy for you to get back up. But if you can go undetected, then you can eat for longer. So thinking about how those insects and how those plants are communicating with each other, really interesting. So there's some of the needs. I'm going to talk about the forms here. And so why are leaves certain shapes? There's lots of different things that are going on. The shapes are defined by various huge tables with names. I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but it gives you an idea of how many different leaf shapes there are. And we know some reasons why leaves are different shapes, but we don't know all the reasons. We don't know why there's a hastate and a palmate leaf specifically. We look at these forms as a way for us to look at classification. It helps us if you learn these leaf forms, if you look at in any wildflower book or anything like that, this is going to help you ID those plants really accurately because they do carry on to related species. And so it's really interesting to see that there was probably a reason that these adapted. That reason may not still be here because we're looking at a huge time scale, or it may still be a pressure. There may be a reason that they still exist, but there's lots that we don't know about these leaf forms. Generally, we would think if you need light, if we're talking about our needs, you need light. I want more light. I want more food. So I just want a bigger leaf. So this is Victoria amazonica. It's like a Brazilian water lily. And if I have more leaf area, I'm going to get more light. So if we think about needs, big leaves seems great. So why aren't all of the leaves big? Because then we think about our other needs. We think about water. We think about our stomata, and we know that there's a lot of water loss. Now, a water lily doesn't really need to worry about water loss. It's fine, it's in the water. But if you're a plant that has less water, it may not be efficient to have big leaves because you're going to lose all of that moisture through those stomata, through those pores that are on the leaf. And so generally leaf size is a good starting measure for dryness. So more dry desert plants are generally going to have smaller leaves. Now there's a lot of other factors, but on a very general scale, that does help us a little bit. So if you think of a big lush tropical rainforest, immediately you picture big leaves. If you think of the Australian outback, you may think of little shrubby things with tiny little leaves. You may not have consciously thought why, but that's why we're looking at this measure of dryness. So when you go to different communities around the world, different ecosystems, you can think about that leaf size and say, well, maybe it's because of water as one of those needs, and it's overriding that need for light. So there's other structures to cope with that water loss. Here we have a gum leaf, a eucalypt leaf on the left. They're going to hang vertically That hanging vertically is going to minimize the amount of sun in the hottest part of the day, so really useful in deserts and drought and just like high extreme heat environments. If you've ever seen a traveler palm, which is a palm tree that's like flat, they are doing the same thing. They're minimizing the amount of light at the top, and then they're getting more of that dawn and dusk light, which is less intense, and it's going to reduce the amount of evaporation from that high hot day. So hanging vertically, great. Those traveler palms as well, if we think about that, if they are just getting the dawn and dusk light, they actually work as a navigational tool, and they will tell you which way north and south is. If they're not interrupted by a building right next to it, if they're out in the open, that traveler palm will point north and south, which is pretty cool. So we also see some other things like a waxy cuticle. So a lot of our plants in Australia and out in some desert ecosystems, they feel waxy. And we'll see that sometimes as a more blue-green color, like a glauca color. And that wax or that cuticle layer will actually protect those stomata, those pores, from releasing all their water. So that means I can have a bigger leaf because I have another strategy to deal with it. Similarly, on the right here, we have a plant with some beautiful fine hairs on it. And we see these furry plants quite often. This is going to give you protection from that wind coming through, that convection that's going to pull the water out from your stomata. And it's also going to potentially protect against herbivory. So it's going to be our safety need. And it will also keep some of that frost off and away from damaging tissue deeper in. So again, that's going to be part of our shelter. So we're thinking about these needs and what they're going to do. When we look at some of the leaf forms, you can think about little serrations. We don't have a clear reason why leaves are serrated, but we have a lot of them. One of the theories is that if they're properly sharp and pointy, they're probably a defense against herbivory, so they don't get eaten. That's the same with spines and thorns. We can think of that as that defense. But we've also seen serrations looked at as a way of looking at water loss. Often where the serrated leaves are, that's where a lot of our water tissue is, our xylem tissue is. And so you're increasing the surface area at the edge of your leaf to lose more water. And that can be beneficial, for example, in spring. After a snow, there's now so much water in the ground, it's now in the plant, you're full with water. If I can release that water really quickly in the spring when my new leaves come out, then I can draw that pressure up and I can bring the sap and the nutrients through my plant. So that's one of the theories as well. So we see these things that are happening and we think about those needs, what's happening. One really cool effect, and I hope a few of you have seen this, and if you haven't, you're not staring up at the canopy enough. This is called crown shyness or canopy shyness, which I just think is a lovely name. And you can see that all of these trees are shy on each other. They're not quite touching. Again, we don't know this cause specifically. We have a few theories and we have a few in certain species that seem to be tested to be correct, but it is a complicated system. So we think about the need for light. Well, wouldn't I just want to put all of my energy in and be the tallest and take over? And therefore, I want to grow into that margin. If I do that, I have the risk of growing next to another plant and I'll feel that red blue light. I'll feel that light changing as I get close to my neighbor and I'll know, hey, there's actually a blockage here. So should I spend my energy dealing with that blockage or should I go somewhere else? Should I go up? And so I can avoid that neighbor to not waste my effort and prioritize light somewhere else. The other thing we see is safety. So as those leaves start to rub together in a wind, we're actually damaging each other's leaves. So that abrasion, that limits the growth near each other. And in some forests where that wind has been artificially stopped for those species, the gaps do get filled. So that really shows us that wind there is a priority. It's a really cool effect, and I hope you guys look up and see it because I love crown shyness. So we're thinking about those needs and what they're telling us. There's a reason that the plants are doing this. They've been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. They've probably got it figured out. The other cool theory for crown shyness, which I quite like, is to stop insect spread. And so if you have insects on your leaves, if I don't touch that leaf, then I'm not going to get it. And so it's like a bit of a individual, social distancing as a strategy. I don't know that that has as much evidence compared to the abrasion, but I do like it. So we talk about community and safety again. Communities protect themselves if we look at that connection. And we can see this beautiful clearing. And we see these clearings, and um, the word clearing, I guess, clear as in there's nothing there. But to me, clearing seems associated with like clearing forests, like felling forests. But we see natural clearings all the time. And so I think that's just something of how the terminology has shifted based on our human industry as well. But if I am a really dense community and I connect with all of my mates and we protect each other and we make this single mat, then a seedling of a tree can't grow through this coral fern. It's not able to penetrate. And so it can block out this light in a really uniform way and say, hey, there's no trees here. And similarly, the trees are going to protect themselves as well. They're going to block out the light behind it, and smaller shrubs can't encroach underneath. So when we walk through open areas, are we doing it because it's out of respect for the trees and we don't want to go through the trees? Or is it because it's easier to walk through an open area? And so I'd like you to think about potentially that the trees have shaped our movement as much as we've shaped them. If they grow in certain forms or if they support certain animals as our food, that's going to shape our behavior as well. So there's a fair bit of influence from our plants. Just something to think about. I'm going to talk briefly about colour. Why are leaves green and when are they not? If we look at, like I was mentioning before, this is the waves of light coming through and the green is not absorbed. And so when we see things with colour, it's the light that's come back to us. Ideally, they would be able to capture all of that light and it would make it even more efficient, but they don't capture the green, and that's why it's reflected back into our eyes and we see that. And we can feel that when you walk through a forest and it takes on this different quality of light. It's because it is a different light. We're actually seeing, if we're walking under that canopy, we're seeing a lot more green light and we're feeling it. It's known to make humans calmer. So your forest walk is very much recommended. And the picture behind, they are just some cells. These are of our chloroplasts. They're the green circles in there. The chloroplast is the organelle, so small organ, that has the chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll is the thing that does the conversion. So the chloroplast is the whole warehouse, so to say, and then the actual machine mechanism is in the chlorophyll. And that's what creates the green color for our plants. So when we don't have green, what's going on? So in the late summer, obviously the days are getting shorter and our plants are feeling that. They do have senses. They're able to see the shortening. They're not getting that response from the light throughout the day and it's cooling. And so leaves do have other colors in them, but the green is the dominant. And so when that chlorophyll slowly degrades with the lack of light, it will then show off the other colors. And that's when we start to see our yellows and our reds come through. Our yellows are often hidden beneath the surface. Our orange are often hidden beneath the surface. But things like our red are often put in actively as well. So they can be added on top. And so these colors are being revealed and added and then dropped. And so we think about why our leaves are being dropped off. We talked about it with our insects. It was a safety mechanism. And so what happens in winter, it's very cold. And so traditionally, we always thought you drop your leaves and then we don't have to worry about the high cost of trying to get light during a winter and through the cold. That's true. it's also other things. So it's a bit simplistic, but we're also looking at potentially if it's winter and there's fewer food sources, then we're going to see an increase in herbivory, in insect predation. So if we just don't have the leaves, we're not going to lose them from other things. But we're also going to see water loss, we're going to see damage, we're often going to see snowfall, frost, and we're going to see higher winds in our early winter storms. And so there's a lot of protection that's going on here. So we look at this photo and we go, okay, well then shouldn't everyone lose their leaves in the winter? And if we look behind, we obviously see our spruces and they don't lose their leaves in the winter. They have a protection there that they're able to close up their stomata and curl over, and so their stomata are protected, so they're not going to be losing that water throughout the winter, which they can't really replenish because everything's frozen. And they have a nice waxy cuticle as well, so they do have another protection. So it's a different strategy. If I lose my leaves, I just have to grow them again in spring. It's going to be a fair bit of energy, but I'm going to do it. Whereas a spruce will just say, I'm going to shut down and then I'm going to reactivate. And so they're different strategies. So they're like our autumn colors, but there's other reasons that we see color. And I think if you go through any place in the world and you see color, think to yourself, is it autumn? Is this just turning? And it sounds like a silly question, I think, especially when you're in North America, especially in fall. But in Australia, we have like 4 deciduous trees species. Like that's it. We don't get deciduous trees that often. So if we see color, our first thought is not necessarily that it's fall. It'll be something else, or we're in an urban environment where a lot of European trees have been planted. So if you're ever visiting Australia and you see all the leaves turn, you go, oh, they're so pretty. They're probably not native. We have a couple. We have some down in Tasmania, which are beautiful, and people will travel to see them because for us it's so special. So let's think about the other reasons that you change color. Dieback is a really common one. So this is a couple of trees that are dying back as a result of a drought. And so dieback is the process of reducing either one leaf or a whole branch or sometimes the whole tree when there's an illness or they're not getting their food nutrients, they're not getting their water, so there's a drought or there's a flood. And so if we start to see some of those natural colors coming out underneath the green, we're seeing our yellows, oranges, browns. Ask yourself, why is that happening? And I think that can be quite interesting to think about. What is this plant trying to tell me? Is it sick? Is it avoiding something? What's happening? The other thing we can see is new growth. They often are different colors. We often see reds on our new growths, and the reds are from anthocyanins. There is not a quiz on that. They're present in about 10% of tree species in temperate regions, although famously in New England, it's about 70% of tree species may have the pigment. So often it's not green to say, hey, I'm not green. If I'm new growth, I'm quite vulnerable. So as a safety, if I don't look like a leaf, maybe you won't eat me. But also those colors can also taste quite astringent if they've got tannins in it, and they don't actually taste as good. So it's a defense trying to protect that new growth coming through. It's not prioritizing on photosynthesizing yet. It's just trying to get out there. So these are some of the things that we want to be looking at when we're looking at form, we're looking at color, we're looking at those needs. So I'm going to quickly take you through some of these examples. I'm going to tell you nothing, and I want you to have a little look and a think about what you can tell from the leaves in the pictures. And then I'm going to give you more information and talk you through what I see when I see these pictures. So, thinking caps on. Some are simpler than others. And so ignore the bear. We're not looking at the bear. It's a beautiful bear. But this is just a really basic example of you don't know where this is. You can probably guess because we have other clues like a giant polar bear. But you can tell straight away it's autumn. You don't need any other info. It's just a nice getting us started image. But just from the colors, you have a time of year just looking at this photo. and it gives you a sense of mood and it gives you a sense of context to your image. And it's something that we like to highlight, not just animals, but also their context. So that's a nice, easy starting. It's autumn. We're going to stay in Churchill for a little bit. This is going to be in our northern hemisphere. We can see a few things here. Now, there's the sun. You don't know if this is morning or night. You can see some trees. The trees are in a clump, and you can see that the clump seems to be a little bit sided. So if we look at the tree, especially the one on the left, you can see there's a lot of branches over on the right side. And so if you look at, there's also a picture of them behind me. These are our flagged trees or cromholts, and these have been affected by the wind. So we're thinking about that shelter need. And so without knowing where this is, you could figure out with a compass which direction it is, or if I tell you that the dominant direction of the wind in Churchill is the northwest, then you can tell me that those branches are facing southeast, the opposite. So you can give me the direction of the predominant winds. You can find the direction of the landscape you're in. You can also see that these trees are sheltering themselves. So see how they get taller and they get more bushy as they go along. So it's not just the individual tree, but it's that community together as well. So from that, you can tell the direction, and now you can tell me if this photo is in the morning or if it's in the evening, because if that's southeast and we're pointing in that direction, then we've got the sun over there on the east side. So you can find out all of these information from just looking at those leaves. Again, ignore the polar bear and the cute cub that's nursing. That's not what we're here to talk about. You can see the landscape here, and it's nice to take photos that are zoomed out because you can look across that landscape and you can see that there's different topography. But you can't really, it's pretty flat, but you can use the plants to tell you. We can see in the foreground, there's a sheet of nothing, there's some flat ice, and then we see some willows and a snowbank, and that's going to tell us there's soil, it's not dredged in water, and it's protected from the wind. And so if we look at that line of willows and we extend that back into the background, we can see that this area would be pocked with ice puddles and willows. This gives us an idea of the environment. And in the very distance, we can see the tree line. So we can see that we have the trees at the background, and they are going to tell us that that's going to be a different environment. They're giving us this context. This one here, you can see trees, shrubs, nothing. So what we're seeing is a difference in height. You can tell it's winter, so it makes sense there's no leaves on the front ones. It's cold. So if we think about light availability, we think, okay, well, maybe they'd all be reaching to where there's light. We're not quite seeing that. So if we're not seeing a light need, maybe we're thinking of a shelter need. That would make sense here. We often see on the edges, we see this ramping up like we did with those other spruces in the other image. So we'll see smaller things that are getting a little bit of wind, and they're going to protect the things behind them to grow up, and they're going to protect the trees behind them. We're going to see this angle. And so here we can see that the wind is the main factor here and not the light. They're not all reaching and leaning out. And this is the edge of a road. You see edge effects quite common. I'm going to skip through this one. We can see this new growth. I mentioned it before. The thing to point out with the new growth, I didn't find a nice image of this, so I'm just pointing this out to you. But our new growth generally wants more light. And so if you're in the northern hemisphere, your new growth is often going to lend itself towards the south side. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, we're going to see that more towards the north side. So if you see a lot of bushes and you see all of the red growth on the one side, you can tell whether that's facing north or south, depending which hemisphere you're in. If we look across the top of this canopy, you can see there is some beautiful tall trees in the background. There are Eucalyptus regnans, and in the foreground we can see some fern trees. So we're just looking at a lot of leaves, but what can we tell from this? We can not see a huge color difference. We can see some browns from some old fronds. That shows us they've been living for a while. That's good. We're seeing a full life history. So we're not really looking at color. We're seeing, in terms of light, a very closed canopy. Everything is touching each other pretty closely. So we can infer that underneath, there's not going to be much light coming through. And if there's not much light coming through, what are we likely to see? We're likely to see not many understory plants. We'll see some really big leaf plants trying to compensate. And we can see nice tall trees, and then we can see these ferns. And this gives us an idea of there's shelter from the wind, they allow the ferns to grow higher, but also there's water. And so just by looking at this top canopy, you can tell that there may be a gully there. And underneath we have a stream. And so you can infer, you may not know until you check, but you can infer that there's a stream underneath there. And there is. There's more water. We've got big wet leaf plants. And then we've got the dry, small leaf plants on the outside. Wet, dry, big leaves, small leaves. So we can get an idea of that water quality. This is a park over in Europe. And we can see some trees here. We can see they don't have their leaves. So you can tell me that without knowing anything, this is probably just after autumn or in winter. It's not snowing, so it's a bit lower. And we can see a bit of a lean. We can see this tree in the center has this main branch leading out to the right. And it's probably leaning out to the right because that's where all the best light is. So if we look at most of these trees, they have these big right-leaning branches, and that might tell us that that's pointing towards south. So then you could figure out time of day from that. You could figure out a lot of information just on there's a branch that's sticking out, but it's confirmed by all the other trees, and we want a bit of that consensus. Let's get through these ones because I want you to have some time for questions. But this one's probably one of my favorite. This is during the bluebells. And you can see a really definite difference on the sides of the hills. We have a beautiful green side and we have a really brown side. We can see it's spring. We can even look in the canopy of the trees. There's a lot more green on the left than on the right. Now, this is in the northern hemisphere, and that should be enough information to tell you which side is north and which side is south. So in the spring, we need as much light as we can get, and we'll see those bluebells come up on the south side. So we know that green side is the south facing, and that red side is the north facing. And so those bluebells will tell us where that light availability is. And you'll actually see when the trees come through, the leaves of the trees will start from the bottom and they'll work their way up. They don't want to block themselves, and the bluebells can take advantage of that. So there's some examples. I hope you picked up some tips, and I hope that next time you go walking through the forest, you take a little bit of a closer look at the leaves. Think about what they need, what they're trying to tell you, and maybe it'll help navigate your way through the forest. Thank you guys, and if you have any questions, let us know.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. We do have some, so let's get to them. So, do we know why plants grow more at night than in the light? Would it be all right to grow a plant in the dark first and then place it in the sun?
No, it would not be. You definitely need light. I'm not sure of the full example of it growing more necessarily at the nighttime, but light is essential for growth. Light is the main energy component. So while there may be movement during the night, that could be the processing of that energy and turning that into growth. But that energy is originally coming from the light. So we will see things, imagining seeds underground. They don't have any light, but they're coming up from energy that's already been stored by its parent. And so that seed is a little care package that's being produced. It's not just the new plant, it's also nutrients. And so that nutrients is used to originally grow, but then the first thing it does, pops out a leaf. And that leaf is going to start to produce its own food to further its growth. So don't grow your plants inside in the dark. They do need some light. Obviously, different plants are used to different amounts of light, but definitely need some.
Great, thank you, Nikki. So we've got a couple of questions about color. We have one guest who has some trees in the Chicago area that have burgundy leaves all spring and summer. Do we know why leaves are different colors and how it benefits the trees?
That is a really good question. I'm actually really glad that you asked. Um, Listener who I don't know. But it's a really good question because we see this in especially ornamental trees. And this is a little bit of humans interacting with the environment. We see different levels of color in different plants around the world. We will see we have to be careful about what has actually evolved for a reason that we can see now, or it evolved for a reason that existed in the past and we don't have that trigger for it anymore. Also, versus humans interacting. So, we want to think about that species is if generally we've got less green, we're thinking that's less chlorophyll. We're seeing reds come through as a way potentially to signal that they are more, um, they're not as palatable, they don't taste as good. So it can be a chemical defense, but we will also see some natural variation. And often with our trees, I'm thinking in the Chicago area, I don't know your specific tree, but I know, especially in that north and coming across into the northwestern side, no, eastern, sorry, I'm bad at my east and west. um, we're seeing a lot of those red colors naturally. But then they get selected and they get bred because they look beautiful in our gardens. And they're actually not as efficient as the greener varieties of that same plant. So when you are planting red trees, you actually want to think about providing them extra nutrients because they're spending a lot of energy to actively create that red color that's no longer beneficial really for them. It's actually detrimental to not have as much green. But they look pretty for us. So if you're ever planting or landscaping, you want to add nutrients to your red trees. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that wonderful answer. So, do you know anything about the supposedly strange genetics of ferns, being able to use both blue and red light and hence survive in the deep shade? Is that something you could talk about?
Um, I'm not specifically sure what the question is. Ferns have evolved earlier than our like flowering plants and our gymnosperms. So our ferns are like quite ancient. They're very much adapted to low light conditions. And so we see them with their really, really big fronds, and they're able to be really efficient. They actually often have that deep green color, and that's really, really highly dense with their chlorophyll. And so they can take on very small amounts of that red and that blue light. All of the plants that are green, they're taking both red and blue, but the ferns are very efficient at it. So I'm not sure which specific genetics you're talking about, but they've been very much like selected over the generations to just be highly efficient for low light environments. And if you put them in a really high light environment, often they get sunburnt. It's too much for them. So they're just good at what they do. They're very efficient on it, and they've evolved that way for a long time. Big fronds, deep green. Yeah.
Great. So there's a tree called the gumbo limbo tree in the Everglades, which appears to have green on the trunk. Do you know why that would be?
I'm gonna quickly look at that specific tree just in case there's something else, but without knowing anything um, about it, there's a few reasons we have green on the trunk. Oh yeah. So green, great. Looking at the color, I love that because that color is telling you that there's photosynthetic material. It's material that is turning energy in from the sun. And sometimes leaves are not enough, and trees will actually produce or store their chlorophyll on the trunk. If you think about when you get a tree out in the forest and or like a branch that's fallen and you snap it and you can tell it's still green, they actually store excess chlorophyll in their trunk and then they can use that. So it is a way of just storing it, but also there are plants that will have photosynthetic material on their stems or on their trunks. So they're not just using the leaves, they're also using other tissues. And the reason that they can do that, it can be a drought adaptation. So if leaves are where all those stomatas, those pores are, they're losing a lot of water. but our stems and our trunks, they don't have as many stomata. So there's less risk of losing that water. And so if they can put some of that chlorophyll into other structures, they lose less water and they still get food. So it's a bit of a win-win, but it's not as efficient. It's quite hard to do. So not everything does it. Leaves are much better. But yeah, storing, you'll see green on trunks, even old trunks in a forest are sometimes still being fed nutrients from the trees around it. And so a trunk that's rotted, but then you scratch back the top, it's actually still green underneath. And that shows that there is life, there is chlorophyll stored for when they can access it. Yeah, cool tree. I want to look into that tree.
Deciduous trees seem to flower before they grow. Many plants grow leaves first. Is this a common difference?
It's you're it's a different strategy for different species. Reproduction is a whole other thing. So I'll touch on it briefly. But flowers are reproduction. Flowers are a way of saying, hey, I need to spread my genetics. I need to make children, and it's either so that I can have more of the same around me as a community, or I feel like I'm under threat. So there's a few different ways that plants will flower. There's kind of like a selfish strategy, and then there's like an intergenerational strategy. And so you can either, if I'm feeling stressed, I can either not flower and I can try and focus on making leaves. And if I do that, then maybe I'll survive. And then later, when things are good, I'll worry about flowers. Or I go, oh, I'm under stress. I don't know if I'm going to survive. Quickly, I'm going to put all the reserves of my energy into flowers, and then I can give my offspring the best chance of surviving, and I may not survive. So there's different strategies, and it depends on what. If we think about spring blossoms coming out, it's the first thing that comes out. We've got a lot of hungry insects. They're going to come out and attract a lot of pollinators, but they're allowing not just them to, they know that they have enough energy to make that flower and a leaf later. But if I can get some of those seeds out, then maybe my seedlings can also grow straight away while there's no snow. So it's spring. It's the same like with our animals. It's spring. Let's let's reproduce because the conditions are good, the food availability is good, water, light, all of that. So I'm going to focus on flowers really quickly. I'll worry about myself later because I've got all of summer. But if I can get those seedlings started, I'm going to do that. So it's just different strategies, and they work for individual species in different ecosystems.
Great. Nikki, thank you for that great answer. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you have for us.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your amazing questions. I hope that you stay curious about different leaves and different trees as you walk through anywhere in the world. Have a think about what's happening because it's happening for a reason, and they can tell you quite a lot of stuff. So keep an eye out. There's a few other books as well if you want to. I know a lot of people probably know about Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, and she talks about the mycorrhizal network between the mushrooms and the trees. It's very like story based, quite nice read. But I would also recommend The Hidden Life of Trees. This is by Paul Wolleben. German. Sorry if I mispronounced that. This really talks about how trees communicate and goes a bit more into the biology of things. I really, really like this one. So be curious, be reading, but go out and read those leaves. Thanks, guys.
Nikki, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.